Yet slavery is never characterized as a violent institution by these same people. So when John Brown is called a terrorist, slavery is never seen as a terrorist institution that's premised on terrorism, the use of terrorism by state terrorism as well as local terrorism. So it's interesting that John Brown is called the original American terrorist, when in fact the original American terrorism was terrorism that was used to oppress African people, turn them into property, justify rape, stealing children, stealing labor. Every possible manner of degradation was all premised on the use of violence and the threat of violence. That's terrorism. So let's be honest about that. Fighting against that is not terrorism, it's counterterrorism. And John Brown was a counter-terrorist. If you're going to call him an original, call him an original counter-terrorist. But he understood that sometimes when the state does not support, when there is no support from law and order, as it's called, if there's no support from the church, then good people have to rise up and do the right thing. And if that means using force to push back evil, then you do that. But this was the goal of his life, was to fight slavery. This is how he lived. This is what he thought about at night. His wife, Mary, said that he'd lie awake in bed at night, praying for enslaved people, thinking about what he could do. And this was always John Brown's approach. John Brown was not an insurrectionist. Insurrection is a philosophy of fighting, and not just fighting and running away, but killing the slave master, destroying the slave owner so that they have no legal claim on you. Insurrections typically involved killing the slave master's family, essentially wiping out. This is something, for instance, that we saw earlier in some attempts on the part of Africans to liberate themselves. So the idea that John Brown had was to use force, yes, use violence if necessary, but the object is not to kill slave masters and their families. The idea is not to exterminate slave masters, but to destroy the stability of the slave institution. And this is an idea that grew and developed as he saw, again, the hardness of the heart of the nation, the political inflexibility of any kind of anti-slavery effort. Remember, Lincoln got elected in 1860 with no platform for abolition or emancipation, but with the intention of containing slavery. Lincoln's only determination was to refuse slavery expansion. It wasn't to put an end to slavery. He would have been willing to keep slavery intact and possibly colonize blacks, eventually remunerate slave masters. This was all part of Lincoln's his workbench. It wasn't to destroy slavery. It wasn't to end slavery. So John Brown saw this as an increasing mandate to work to destroy slavery, and to understanding that some action has to be taken because there are no political alternatives. And so again, we have to ask ourselves, what do you do when there aren't any political alternatives? What do you do when the law of the land aligns itself with the racism of the worst kind and the injustices of the worst kind? What do you do? And so this is his response. And again, he's not the only one. The fact that John Brown was supported by black leaders, working people in the black community, as well as white abolitionist leaders, even though they may not have agreed on strategy, but the fact that he was proposing an idea was something that they understood was necessary. They believed that this was something worthy of support. But what clinched it for him, of course, is when he went to Kansas. And he went to Kansas in 1855 really to protect his family. His sons had migrated to Kansas. Kansas had become a territory. It wasn't a state yet. And of course, when it became a territory, the argument was, is it going to be a slave state or a free state? Is it going to be a state with slaves or not? And so the political trend then went in the direction of what was called popular sovereignty, that the settlers would decide for themselves, that white people would decide the future of Kansas by settling there and then voting, and the majority would determine. And so what happened was a grand movement. A lot of Northerners began to move into Kansas with the intention of it being a free state. Now keep in mind, not a state that is friendly to black people, just a state that has no slavery. And many of the settlers in Kansas were white people who did not like slavery but did not want black people in Kansas. Then you have Southerners who wanted to come to Kansas and bring their black people there as slaves so that they could expand the economy and the structure of slavery. This is what was going on in Kansas in the 1850s. John Brown's sons, both some married sons and some single sons, went out there in 1854 and began to establish themselves. And in the spring of 1855, John Brown got a letter from his son, John Jr., stating that things weren't looking good there. That, in fact, they had gone out there to establish a farm. They didn't bring weapons out there, but the pro-slavery faction was coming into Kansas territory and using violence, using terrorism, and that they would need weapons because they saw the need to defend themselves. John Brown got his stuff together, got guns. He stopped at an anti-slavery convention in New York. He went, as he was going west, he stopped in his hometown of Ohio, and he gathered weapons there, and then went off to Kansas. And he arrived there in October of 1855, and from October of 1855 until the spring of 1856, he never raised a hand against anybody. He never threatened anybody. He simply lived there, supported his family, helped them when they were sick, helped them build their little cabins, and tried to help them to establish themselves. But what he saw was that this militancy of the pro-slavery terrorism was advancing into the territory. And he didn't take action until in the spring of 1856. It was not just clear that something was coming. It was clear that it had happened already. And what was happening was that pro-slavery forces, with the winking eye of Washington, had invaded Kansas. In different situations, five Free State men, as they were called, were murdered, and that these terrorists, who are euphemistically called border ruffians, which is just what we would call terrorists today, they were using force and violence to intimidate the Free State majority into accepting a pro-slavery constitution for the state of Kansas as it would come into the Union. And this ultimately culminated in attacks on Free State people, attack on the city of Lawrence, which was a Free State town. Potawatomi is considered the bad mark of John Brown. People pick on Potawatomi, they select it. In some respects, of course, one wishes that it didn't happen because it involved death and killing. But we need to understand what happened so that we can kind of liberate John Brown from the unnecessary burden of this in his story. We've established that Kansas was a place that had been infiltrated by terrorists, that Free State people were being intimidated, attacked, and assaulted. There was actually a breakdown of law and order. There were various territorial governors in Kansas, but in the spring of 1856, there was no real law. There was no rule of law. There was no protection for anybody, whether they were pro-slavery or anti-slavery. What there were these gangs of terrorists who were working, and with help from people from the Deep South and certainly from Missouri. There was this presence of pro-slavery thugs and terrorists who had come in. The Free State settlers were largely, I don't want to say they were pacifists, but they were trusting in the federal government, unduly so. They looked to the government and seemed to believe that things were going to work out better, and they didn't become militant. And so they were being picked on, they were being abused. And although they were the majority, they were vulnerable to these attacks. But there were a handful of leaders. Brown was only one of them. And maybe not the most important one, but he was certainly one who said, if for no other reason, I'm going to protect my family. That it is, after all. He didn't go there to settle. He went there to protect his family. And he brought weapons there for the express purpose of arming his family and Free State people to defend themselves. And he became caught up in the Civil War that was going on in Kansas, but indeed he went there to protect his family, and that remained his priority. Well, we've established that the people in Kansas who were Free State were largely Free State and pro-white. Even Southerners who came there, there were anti-slavery Southerners who were there, but they didn't want blacks there. And so what do you do when the Brown family arrives there? The Browns are not your typical Free State people. You see, you have Free State people, and then you have abolitionists. And among the abolitionists, you have people like the Browns who are pro-black. They are pro-black in the sense that they are arguing for the complete equality and brotherhood of humanity. And so when the Browns come to Kansas, they are distinguished not just by their anti-slavery conviction, but by their pro-black conviction. And this puts a mark over their heads in the eyes of the local pro-slavery people. In Osawatomie, there are settlers who are pro-slavery, and there were settlers who were Free State people, and then there were the Browns who were Free State people of a militant stripe. And the pro-slavery people identified the Browns, knew the Browns were of a political perspective that they despised. And we need to understand this because what's going on in May of 1856 is the radical intrusion and attack on the part of pro-slavery terrorism in the Kansas Territory. And we know about Lawrence being sacked at the end of May, and this is at the same time the Browns and others were expecting some kind of an attack upon Osawatomie. Now, some of their local pro-slavery neighbors were not just pro-slavery in sentiment. The Browns would not have attacked them had they just been pro-slavery. The Browns attacked specific men who were involved in collaborative efforts with this terrorist movement. There was a group of armed ruffians, so-called, who had come into the area, and the intention they had was to attack Osawatomie and to get the Browns. Now, John Brown was informed of this by leaders in the Free State community, and because John Brown was extremely careful that he would never make a move, he in fact was probably overly ponderous. This is probably what ruined him at the end at Harper's Ferry, that he thought too much about stuff. But he would never have taken an action without studying, and what he did was he conducted his own surveillance. He went into the pro-slavery ruffian camp under the guise of being a surveyor. And at that time, surveyors were largely pro-slavery men who got jobs through the government. And he went into this camp and did surveillance and actually learned that his family were marked for attack. Furthermore, he saw and found out and confirmed the information that was given that the people who were aiding in this attack were some of these specific pro-slavery activists. These weren't just men who believed in slavery. They weren't just settlers. They were people who were collaborating in the overthrow of the Free State settlements. And he had actually heard that the damn Browns were going to be wiped out. So you do the math. You have a guy who comes there to protect his family. He's not a pacifist. He's not going to sit on his hands. He's going to protect his family, and he's going to fight against the abuses of the pro-slavery faction. If specific people are identified, a list is given to him with names of men who are involved in this activity and who are conspiring to bring destruction upon his family. And when Lawrence, the Free State town of Lawrence, was attacked, they were in full anticipation that Osawatomie was going to be attacked. And Brown knew that this was going to have dire consequences for his family. And after doing his homework, after studying, he decided that something had to be done. And what was chosen, what he chose to do was, it's horrible to think about it. No one likes to think about violence of that nature. But Brown's philosophy was, and essentially, you attack specific people, strategically remove the ones who are going to act as those who are going to bring this in. They're going to act as the guides. They act as the vector for this terrorism. And they found 5 of the men on their list, and they executed them. They attacked them at night, and it's true, and they executed them. Brown himself led this. He supervised it. He supported it. His son-in-law, his sons, and another neighbor participated in these actions. And as while they were ugly, I think we have to keep in mind, again, there was a civil war going on. It was a de facto civil war. There was no protection. The Browns could not appeal to Washington, D.C. They couldn't appeal to the state. They couldn't look to any support. If they were going to be attacked, they had to protect themselves. And rather than wait to be attacked, they chose to, as John Brown Jr. later said, to get the jump on these people, and they attacked them. He understood that it was necessary. He said it was necessary. His son-in-law, Henry Thompson, who was one of the sword wielding men involved, till the day he died, said it was absolutely necessary. This was something that they had to do, and they didn't apologize for it, because they understood, first of all, that had they done nothing like the other Free State people, they would themselves have been victimized. They already had the example of 5 men who had been brutally murdered. John Brown saw the body of one of these men laid out and saw his wife crying over him. And he had not come to Kansas to see this happen to his family. And so the actions that he took, in light of the fact that it was wartime, in light of the fact that there was no appeal to law, rule of law, there was no protection, there was no police department, no FBI, no one that allegedly could send protection. There was no one to appeal to. They had to protect themselves. We know that, after the fact that, of course, the Browns were, from the Free State side, there was a backing off of this because it was so blunt, because it was so straightforward, because it was such a devastating act that the Free State people, who were not really standing up to fight anyway, were falling all over themselves, as it were, to apologize, and the Browns were criticized heavily for this, and John Brown was characterized, of course, as a criminal in this matter. But it's often been said that matters worsened as a result of this, but in reality, matters were already out of hand. And the reality is that the pro-slavery side was intent on getting what they wanted, which means that their violence and their movement into Kansas wasn't about John Brown. It wasn't. They may have reacted in terms of the episode with the increased intensity to get him, but the fact is that the violence that occurred, because Osawatomie was then attacked in the summer of that year, but that just was really a second attempt on the part. That was their original intention. So what Brown had really done was he had forced them back, and he had gotten a number of months relief for Osawatomie. But it didn't stop them, because they were determined. And it wasn't really until the use of force became more common, and then when other leaders began to use force to fight pro-slavery, then this is what really began to turn the tide. So it was very clear that slavery by nature was a violent institution, and that it used violence, and that the only way that slavery in the United States could be defeated was by the use of violence. And ultimately this was proven that it took a civil war to destroy just the mechanism of slavery, to stop, because this was how determined this segment of the country was to keep slavery and even expand it. And John Brown was studying the pro-slavery policies and studying pro-slavery politicians. He understood that their intentions were not compromised, that their intentions were to have what they wanted. And he told William Phillips, who was a journalist, he told him in early 1859, he said that he studied and had seen how Southern politicians were preparing for either war or secession, that they were using their influence in government, using their influence to position themselves, and that he feared that the nation was on the brink of a great crisis. Well, he understood rightly, and he wasn't the only one who saw this. But what was going on in Kansas was clearly a testing ground for what was going to happen in a matter of years in the United States. And it was very clear that slavery was such a violent institution that it would take violence. So people who would like to blame Brown, or first of all isolate him and view him as a terrorist, they're simply being irresponsible historically. And second of all, the reality is that what Brown showed was that even his ultimate efforts would not be sufficient, because he wasn't violent enough. And in fact, the strategy he had hoped to use was really a minimalist violent campaign when it came to what he did in the South. But what was going on in Kansas was not simply about fighting slavery. It was really about self-defense. It was really about protecting his family. And when you understand the tight-knit nature of the Brown family, that they were close and they were committed abolitionists, and that they were not people who espoused nonviolence, it's no surprise that they would use force. Now, what is also we need to mention too is that when they took these particular terrorists or pro-terrorist people out to kill them, in one case, the Mahela Doyle, who was the wife of the man, one of the men and two of his adult sons who were killed, Mahela Doyle rebuked her husband. She said, "I told you this was going to happen for the kind of devilment you're practicing." So even out of the mouths of the witness of the victim, so-called, there was that this woman understood that her husband and her sons were involved in something that was wrong. And so we need to clarify that these victims in Potawatomi were not innocent. And they weren't simply pro-slavery people. They were terrorists and people supporting terrorism.